Hello and welcome to the MESAM podcast. This is the podcast where we talk to MESAM members and associates about their current or recent research into the medieval world of Central Europe. I'm Karen Culver, and today I'm happy to be back in Vienna at the CEU campus, meeting with Michał Machalski to discuss his recent research into rulers, subject and loyalty in 13th century Poland. Michał is a historian of medieval Poland. He's studied and researched at universities in Wrocław, Warsaw, Budapest and Vienna. In March 2026, he successfully defended his doctoral thesis at Central European University, titled Imagining Loyalty in Fragmented Poland, 1200 to 1333. Interestingly, his doctoral supervisors were Professors Katalin Cindy and Balázs Nagy, whom many of us know as two of the leading lights of MESAM. Michał is currently developing further research on the political culture of Central Europe in the High Middle Ages. He also tells me that now he's completed the major task of writing and defending his thesis, he hopes to find time to pick up and play his trumpet again, but is convinced his neighbours are very happy that so far he has been too busy. Michał, welcome to the MESAM podcast.
Hello, Karen. It's nice to be here.
Good. Now, I have read much of your thesis and realised that many of the kings or members of the ruling families have nicknames such as Władysław Spindleshanks, Bolesław the Bald, or Henrik the Bearded. Many names which are not totally polite. Were they known by these names in their lifetime, or were the nicknames added only later to help identify them?
Well, as always, the answers vary depending on the ruler. I think it is not particularly uncommon for members of the dynasty, especially as numerous as the Polish Piast dynasty, to carry the nicknames, as you've called them. A lot of those are medieval in origin, but their contemporaneity can be put into question. From the ones that you've brought up, Władysław the Spindleshanks, who is a 12th century ruler of Greater Poland. If I remember correctly, this nickname appears only in Chronicle of Greater Poland, which is probably second half of the 14th century. So we're talking here about a difference of numerous generations between putting the name to the paper and the ruler himself. Henrik the Bearded, the Duke of Silesia, better known as the husband of Saint Hedwig, probably because of his famous wife. We have more immediate sources from his reign, and he is called Henrik with beard already by 2 generations afterwards. And this one is probably likely to be contemporary. Bolesław the Bald, that's Henrik the Bearded's oldest grandson, who's a very interesting case because in the contemporary chronicle he appears as bald, but perhaps in contemporary Polish historiography he's mostly referred to as rogatka, so the one with horns. So there is some devilish character captured in this nickname. So clearly someone with a very, very colorful depictions in Polish historiography. And this is a nickname that is written down in the Traskas Annal, which is a compilation of Krakow Franciscans that is probably drawing also on some Silesian tradition. So the dating here again is very difficult. Interesting thing there is that this rogatka is written in Polish, so it's written in vernacular.
I'm now curious to know how people knew that, for example, Władysław had Spindleshanks.
And that is a very interesting question. So we usually don't get proper explanations for those. Some of them are self-explanatory, like we have several Piasts who are nicknamed the White, and we have Leszek the Black, which most likely just refers to the hair color. But with Spindleshanks, here we have to rely on 15th century tradition to explain to us that it is because thin legs.
Yes. Coming back to the actual work of your thesis, which I'm sure all these nicknames weren't, your central focus of your research was on loyalty and mutual loyalty between the rulers and the ruled. Where did these concepts of loyalty originate, and how deeply, how far down into society did they go?
So I think it's important to first recognize that these ideas are historically contingent, and there's no single way in which loyalty was imagined across time and space. And the authors of the sources that we have access to from 13th century Poland, which were the focus of my study, would draw on the intellectual work done by clergymen and lawyers across Latin Europe, older norms of the local retinue warrior culture, as well as the new ideas shaped by emerging chivalric culture. As far as how deep did they go, it is difficult to say, because the sources are usually written by either clergymen or people working at the ducal chanceries. So naturally they present only a certain perspective that applies to the very top of the Polish medieval society. But at times, some of them allow us to see the common subject's opinion or the opinion of the townspeople, and it is aligning in some parts to the general picture. I think it is important to also note that the medieval authors were aware that these cultural norms that they're describing are not shared by everyone. So they would at times literally describe rulers or the wives of the rulers having to teach the subjects how to be obedient to the king.
Yes, that sounds like a fearsome kind of wife.
Oh, yeah.
So what did the bonds of loyalty mean to both sides? You mentioned in your thesis there was the giving of gifts and the swearing of allegiance. What actions were then required, if any?
So I would characterize oath-taking or gift-giving as the ways of forming or strengthening the bonds of loyalty, but I wouldn't characterize them as what actually constitutes loyalty itself. Now, what actions would they require, or what exactly the contents of those bonds are, is challenging to say from the sources. So the first thing to note is that the sources are more happy to tell us what are the boundaries beyond we can say that someone is not loyal. And those remain unchanging across 13th century and would boil down to not hurting the physical person and their honor. So not only their good fame, but also social standing and claims, rights, and interests. But beyond this negative, it is much more complicated to say what it exactly is that is expected of loyal subjects. Here we can turn to depictions of those subjects who are particularly praised for their loyalty. And they earn this description by providing counsel to the rulers, by leading the armies, but also by offering to sacrifice either their lives or positions for the ruler or the country. So it is those three aspects, and especially the question of sacrifice and the willingness to put one's body or possessions in harm's way in service of the ruler that is usually pointed to by the later sources. And in Silesian Chronica Polonorum, we can find stories like the one of Peregrine of Wissembourg, who is a knight of Henrik the Bearded, who dies in the surprise attack of Pomeranians who attack the camp in which a number of Piast dukes are camped at. Duke Leszek the White is killed, and Henrik the Bearded is protected by the Knight Peregrine of Wissembourg, covers him with his body, and is killed in the service of the Duke. And chronicler notes this, and notes also with a little bit of scolding that none of the sons of Peregrine had lived up to the example set up by the father in his loyal service. And it's precisely this type of heroic deed that is later described in those charters who care to elaborate on what exactly they mean when they praise the subjects for the loyal service. What I think is quite important is that later on in the 14th century, we can even see how this demonstration of loyalty on the battlefield becomes an argument for someone's unwavering loyalty. What I mean by this is, in the example of Palatine Władysław Szamotuły, who is a greater Polish noble, he becomes conflicted with King Władysław the Short. It is during the time of military campaigns of the Teutonic Order against a recently unified kingdom, and some of the sources suspect or accuse Władysław of Szamotuły of treason, saying that because he was conflicted with the king, that it is he that brought in the Teutonic Knights and let their army sneak into the kingdom. But on the other hand, the very same author says that the same Palatine reconciled quite quickly with the king, joined his army, and there he showed extraordinary bravery. And because of it, he does not believe he could have ever really been a traitor.
Yeah, that's a complicated one. And I could understand how to express loyalty as actions in a charter would be almost impossible. Yeah, that's a difficult one. I can see why it was put as examples rather than actions to be taken. But what you were saying about someone switching sides really brings me to another question I was thinking on. We know at this time Poland was highly fragmented. There were many dukedoms that were in conflict. We have these extended families. Were they always within one region and thus one line of loyalty for the whole family? Or did families extend over several nobles' land holdings, giving them competing loyalties? Which became more important, family or the noble? And how was all that resolved?
So this is a very interesting question indeed, one that touches on complicated history of the Polish 13th century. But the question of clan solidarity over loyalty to the Duke is something that does appear in the sources. For example, Leszek the Black, who was a Kujagan Piast, who would come to rule Lesser Polish Duchy of Krakow because of the extinction of the local line, would face a lot of pushback from the local nobility, and thus would face a rebellion of the most important of Lesser Polish nobles. But we know that in 1285 he did defeat the rebels, and after defeating the rebels he issued a a series of diplomas which do document quite well who behaved well and who did not behave well, who kept their loyalty and who did not. And yes, among those diplomas, there is a diploma issued for Stanisław of Chrobrz, thanking him for his loyalty, even in the face of the fact that Stanisław had to abandon all of his brothers and friends in order to remain loyal to Leszek. And for that, he received the village of Kępów and a number of other rights and privileges. So this event is described as something unexpected or something particularly worthy of singling out and praising. We don't know how many Stanisławs like that were. So in that sense, we can intuit some kind of belief in the solidarity or obligations between family members that would at least be could be in conflict with their obligations to the ruler. But on the other hand, we have to be, I think, as historians, quite careful in order to not extend this idea of solidarity too broadly, because the sources that I've mentioned are talking here about relatively close family members.
You mentioned one Stanislav who was loyal to the nobleman, the Duke, and at the same time effectively disloyal to his own family. That might have been quite a conflict. And I wonder if it came down to the Duke offered him a village and his brothers and family just said, we'll buy you supper. Who knows? I mean, it could have been as transactional as that. But did these aspects of loyalty ever become formalised and institutionalised? And if they did, what was the context for the formalisation?
It is a complicated question. To try to answer it, let's unpack this. Institutionalization of bonds of loyalty, when we look at the examples of the neighboring medieval polities like Bohemia, would require a use of more explicit legal instruments that would, as we discussed, outline more properly what it means to be loyal, or correspondingly would involve a more formal and thorough use of written documents. And in 13th century Poland, this process of formalization is never completed. So when it comes to obligations, I've talked previously about what it meant to be loyal, about the loyal service of the knights, and parts of those service were actually referred to in charters. But as far as we know, until the end of the 14th century, this law remained uncodified or unformalized. It appears that only in Silesia, by the late 13th century, there was some degree of formalization of that law, with a set amount of war horses being provided from set amount of land. But even then, those who refused service, as expected under military law, were just made to pay the fine and not described as disloyal. In contrast to Poland stands 13th century, late 13th century Bohemia, where the oaths of loyalty became formalized and written down in the last decades of 13th century, during the youth and adulthood of Wacław II, becoming a Duke of Krakow and even King of Poland in 1300. This practice that he brought with him, with documents demanding sworn loyalty from, let's say, Władysław the Short, who will later become Polish king. He was made to swear an oath of loyalty. There were different piasts that did swore an homage to the king and issuing the documents in which they swore homage, and compared themselves to different loyal servants of the king as if they swore a loyalty oath. So clearly there was awareness of this type of tool of institutionalizing loyalty, because so many Piasts were forced to swear to Václav II. But there are very limited examples of Piasts themselves demanding homage or receiving sworn oaths that would take a similar diplomatic form.
Interesting. As you were talking, I'm thinking the loyalty you're talking about is from the lower levels of nobility to the higher levels. Did the higher levels of nobility ever have to demonstrate any loyalty to their subjects?
So when we are referring to the loyalty of the rulers to their subjects, this is definitely something that is expected by some chroniclers in their visions of loyalty that binds those two groups. So to come all the way back to the early 13th century, Chronica Polonorum of Vincentius of Krakow, there it is quite clear that loyalty is something that should be exhibited also by the ruler. This, of course, stems from the very peculiar set of political ideas that Vincentius of Krakow has about Poland as Respublika, which is ruled by the rulers, but the rulers do not rule alone. They do so with the help of the broader elites, who are the arbiters of the duke's rule. And if dukes are not virtuous enough, or they are endangering the virtuous character of Respublika, then the political community is allowed to get rid of such dukes. This is what had happened in Vincentius's lifetime, as his patron, Kazimierz the Just, was brought to power precisely through such an overthrow of Duke Mieszko the Old. So we can see where the political concerns of the patron align with the ideas expressed by the chronicler. Nevertheless, we know throughout the rest of the 13th century that Vincentius was definitely not the only person to believe that bonds of loyalty between rulers and subjects can be dissolved if the rulers are violating those relationships in some ways. We have an example of already mentioned Bolesław the Bold, the Horned, who is facing a rebellion of his subjects in 1240s. One of many rebellions, but this one is caused by Bolesław's imprisonment of his former favorite, who is imprisoned because Bolesław needs to extort money in order to pay for German mercenary, which might or might not be true. The violation of Iko's honor is what leads the local nobility to rise up against Bolesław. Similarly, quite controversially, the future king of Poland, Władysław the Short, is foiled in his first attempts at ruling Greater Poland by the rebellion that leads to him having to leave Poland in general and go into exile, probably to Hungary. The explanations for this rebellion are given in Greater Polish sources, quite interestingly written shortly before Władysław's return.
So come on, what were
While
they?
historiography likes to point out to also different, more complicated reasons, the sources agree that he was excommunicated and exiled because he was not good keeper of peace. he could not bring order to Greater Poland. He allowed the possessions of Bishop of Poznań to be plagued by robbers. His own soldiers were also not behaving properly in Greater Poland, and because of the lack of ability to bring peace and order, which was one of the most important rules of kingship, he was deposed, and Wacław II, King of Bohemia, was brought in to rule Greater Poland.
A minute ago, you mentioned one of the bishops, and it struck me that you haven't talked about the church at all, and yet it was a deeply religious society, I imagine. Was the church involved in oaths of loyalty? And if so, to whom?
Yeah, so this is an excellent question, and I siloed the bishops and the churchmen out of my research because of the concern of the scope. Because obviously the churchmen, the abbots, they all have their own loyalties, which are not only to the rulers, but also to the founders and to the religious hierarchies. And those create extremely complicated entanglements, which are further laborious to research, because this is also the group that is most happy to use writing in order to record their problems.
Yes, and they will probably record it from their own perspective, making them look as wonderful as possible.
Well, it depends. To some degree, yes. But not all of the bishops have same ideas about politics of the time. So we do have equally embittered rivalries within church hierarchy as we do between the Piast dukes. It would take too long to list all of the conflicts between within the hierarchy itself or between Piast dukes and the bishops. So I have not attempted it in my research, and I will not attempt it here. But I will rather focus on the relationship between other subjects and the rulers, because the members of the church hierarchy, they are able to successfully present themselves as neutral arbiters in a lot of Piast conflicts. So going on from the times of Vincentius of Krakow, who finishes writing his chronicle because he becomes Bishop of Krakow, and is probably not unbiased in his opinion that it is the churchmen, and especially bishops of Krakow, that should act as arbiters of Piast rule and should act as guarantors of mutual promises and oaths that are taken up either by the subjects to the rulers or by different Piast rulers to each other. And this becomes a relatively regular practice in which a conflict between Piast rulers is attempted to be solved by an oath which is sworn with Polish bishops as witnesses. Moreover, in 1233, at the local synod in Sieradz, the Polish churchmen put it as their prerogative to excommunicate any ruler or knight that has sworn a false oath in front of a bishop. The question is how much this threat of excommunication is being taken seriously by Polish Piasts. Indeed, some of them are convinced and seek to end their conflict with bishops as quickly as possible. There are some, like famously, again, Bolesław the Bold, or his nephew, Henryk IV of Wrocław, who engage in a prolonged conflicts with Tomasz I and Tomasz II, bishops of Wrocław, and do become excommunicated, but seem to be able to deal with it well but the copious amount of letters that is sent by Tomasz II to anyone else that would listen paints a picture of even the local church that is quite firmly divided in their loyalties between the duke and the bishop. Quite interestingly, this is also the most explicit mention of loyalty owed to the subjects to the excommunicated ruler, because Tomasz II knows that in accordance to the canon law, he has to ask the Pope to annul the oaths of loyalty that were sworn to the excommunicated ruler in a separate bull. He does ask for this act, but as well as he asks for the crusade against Henrik IV, but neither of those comes to pass. But it is quite interesting to see that both the dissolution of the bonds of loyalty of the subjects to the excommunicated ruler and the crusade against said ruler are seen, let's say, as equally solutions of last resort.
You've been talking about the church as if the church effectively became part of the judiciary and, as they could issue excommunication, also the source of punishment, which actually made me remember in one of your chapters you talk about the judiciary, and it was a trial in Warsaw in 1339, if I remember correctly. What was the trial and why was it important in terms of loyalty to the Polish society?
So Warsaw trial was the second in the whole series of Polish Teutonic trials, so the trials between Polish monarchs and the Teutonic Order.
And the Teutonic Order dominated quite a lot of northeast Poland at the time.
Yes, so the Teutonic Order at the time, so we're talking here about the turn of the 14th century, was brought to Prussia in 13th century, which it conquered and Christianized, establishing the power base there. And the political crisis in Poland at the turn of the 14th century as occasion for further territorial expansion on the peripheries of Piast domains. So, while initially allied to Władysław the Short, Kievan Piast, who would later become king of Poland, and called upon as an ally to help Władysław quell rebellion at Gdańsk, and then refused to leave, taking the possession. This led to military confrontations, which did not go particularly well for the Polish monarch. And so the Władysław the Short and later on his son, Kazimierz the Great, sought to resolve the conflict with a judicial trial in front of the papal legates. The first trial, which took place in 3020-21, the articles of that trial accuse Teutonic Order of usurping the rights to Pomerania, was not well prepared. And so the Warsaw trial, what makes the trial special is that it is a conscious effort of Polish king to present himself as the king of unified Poland, defined where the borders of Poland have laid since time immemorial, as the document states, and moreover to corroborate these claims with testimonies of over 100 witnesses who are coming from all over Poland, are coming from very diverse social and family backgrounds. So we're talking here about representatives of most of the big clans. We're talking about abbots, members of cathedral chapters, bishops, parish priests. We're talking about important nobles, but we're also talking about common knights living in the borderlands between Poland and the lands of Teutonic Order. So what we're lacking is women and peasants, but other than that, everyone is represented to some degree, including townspeople. And so the testimonies, which are in some way guided by the articles of interrogation, but I would argue their diversity suggests that they were not guided very strictly, are probably the best we are able to get as far as 13th and early 14th century sources to the intimate insight into subjects' own thoughts about Piast rights and Piast rulership, be it in contested lands or elsewhere.
Wow, that is amazing. That must be just so interesting to read, to be able to see what ordinary people were thinking about something as big and important as borderlands and rulers' rights.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it must also have been quite fundamental in rebuilding Poland as a whole concept, as a nation.
So this is definitely an argument that can be made, that the internal ideological value of the process itself was equally important for Kazimierz the Great as his chances to solve the issue in front of the papal court. So one can see, as very famous Polish medievalist Janusz Bieniak did, the trial as a rallying point around a unified royal vision of what this new unified kingdom always was and will be. Because we have to keep in mind that a lot of the subjects that are being interrogated there are much, much older than the kingdom itself.
Yeah, I suppose so. And unfortunately, Michał, on that really interesting point, which I'd love to dive into a lot more, we're going to have to leave it there because we've run out of time. It's been absolutely fascinating hearing all about early Polish oaths of loyalty. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you very much for having me.
Today I have been talking to Michał Machalski about his research into rulers, subjects and loyalty in 13th century Poland. My thanks to everyone for listening. I hope you found it as interesting, informative and enjoyable as I did. Please do look out for the next MISEM podcast, in which MISEM members and associates talk about their recent or ongoing research into the medieval world of Central Europe. And if you have research that you're doing and you would like to talk about it to MISEM, please do contact me through the MISEM board or website administrator. In the meantime, I'm Karen Culver for the MISEM podcast. Thank you and goodbye.